Dressed in solidarity with Barack Obama this weekend, who received a lot of flack for wearing beige on Labor Day weekend. So I see a number of you are also holding out for the summer. Very good thing. We're still in this sensual journey. As I said earlier, we're talking about sight today, and after Amanda's sharing that story about your brother perhaps losing his sight, but not as a result of a violent encounter, I'm very acutely aware of how integral sight is to us, and how it is that we live surrounded by what our brains take in and read most prominently to help us understand the world around us. A couple of weeks ago when I spoke about hearing, maybe that was last week, I talked about the people in New Guinea who chart their world more with sound. And so as I was reading and listening to talks on YouTube this week in preparation for today, and learning that vision is really the predominant function that our brain uses, I wondered if the people of New Guinea, if their brains actually have a predominant function around hearing rather than vision. But that is a mystery to me. I couldn't find that information on any of the pieces that I looked at. We know how sight works pretty much. You have light comes in through your eyes, it passes through the optic nerve, finds its definition at the very back of the brain. No one seems to know why something that's at the front, so close to the front, is interpreted so far in the back. But what happens in that process is beginning to become unfolded through the use of magnetic resonance imaging and the exploration by a variety of scientists who look at vision to help figure out how we find meaning in the world. Scott's thesis is about morality, actually, and where we ground our morality, and whether or not we ground it in divine things that we call divine or supernatural or the natural world. We come to understand our world through our senses, and so that informs our morality and how we make decisions, because the stimuli that comes into our brain is absolutely meaningless unless we apply meaning to it. The things that come into our brain that come through the optic nerve are nothing but bits and pieces of light. Their color and their value help us figure out what they are, and we attribute meaning to them. And so, because we are born with an optic nerve, and without that meaning, children don't see colors, they don't interpret things until they are given the opportunity to create meaning of those interpretations. And so what we see develops meaning for us. Some of the many very exciting things that you can watch on the internet about vision have such intriguing concepts behind them that I would really send you to look for them. On my 15K training walk yesterday, I phoned Scott, who had sent me a bunch of links on YouTube to listen to while I was on my 4 hours of walking. One of which I listened to, and then I phoned him and I said, you got to look up this guy, the rest of this guy's work, because I only had like 3.5 minutes. Where's the rest of the lecture? So he looked for ages and couldn't find it, found some interesting ones. I'd given him the wrong name. It was no wonder he couldn't find it. But the gentleman whose work I was looking for was actually Bo Lotto, who has done a lot of work about illusion and how we come to understand things and how we can trick ourselves into doing things. I had slides on the PowerPoint that isn't here, but I'll tell you about them. And some of you may have actually seen slides like this, and so you understand what's going on. But one of the slides that Lotto shows is a slide that has a picture of a desert scene, mirror imaged on the bottom. And on the top is a green panel and a red panel with a dot in the middle. And he tells you to stare at the dot in the middle for about 30 seconds. What he's trying to prove to you is that your brain is trainable, that it starts making sense of the world based on what has gone before, that you can only make sense of images that you see based on what you have seen before, that those neurons in your head that are firing all over the place, that are starting to connect with one another, attach value and information. If any of you have got an email that says, "Can you read this?" and it's a bunch of words that have strange letters in them, or there's a bunch of letters missing, you can read it perfectly because your brain knows that a WH blank T has an A in the blank. Your brain fills that in because of your previous knowledge. If it was in a different language and they took the letters out, you wouldn't be able to read it because you can't actually assume what letter's going to be there. You wouldn't know. Your brain has nothing to take out of the past history and make it known. So in this, you've stared now. Remember, you're staring at this little dot in the red and green. If you got that in your head, we're training your brain if you actually had the slide in front of you. And then he says, okay, now look down at the dot between the two desert scenes. Now it's a desert scene, and it's beautiful, sandy, Arizona orange color with a blue sky. But when you look down on it, having stared at those panels, the two pictures are radically different because your brain has assumed that everything coming from one side is being filtered through red and everything coming from the other side is being filtered through green, and so it compensates for that, and you end up with these different looking pictures. Scott and I, in one of the very first times we went away together, we were in Virginia. We were by a waterfall and sitting on the side of the waterfall, and I was staring at this waterfall and watching the water go down. It was just beautiful, incredibly beautiful. And then I took my eyes off it and looked at the stones beside it, which suddenly were racing up toward the sky. Because I had trained my brain that everything was going down, and so it needed to compensate for that. Try it next time you're by a big waterfall. Stare at it for a little while and then look off to the side and see how things start changing in your brain. As with hearing, last week I talked about our capacity to make a number of different languages, that our brains are open to making all kinds of different sounds that are familiar in several different languages. Not all of them are familiar in any particular one language. So as we learn our language, we learn the capacity for the sounds in that language, and we lose the other capacity. It's just not there anymore. Similarly with sight. Children, very young children, at a very early age, can distinguish the faces of chimpanzees. They can tell one chimpanzee from another. How many of you can tell a chimpanzee from another? You can't. Because the people that are normally around you, those are the ones that you normally see the distinction of faces amongst. And so you can tell people of your own race apart much more easily than you can people of another race, because your brain hasn't made those accommodations in its head, and it's lost the capacity to do that well. In the same way that if you're trying to learn Hebrew or something like that, you're going to have difficulty because your voice cannot make the sounds without some significant work on the part of your brain. Now, the thing about sight is that we're taking in that factual history all the time. We're putting it together. We're making sense of things. We can trick ourselves, as Bo Lotto teaches us very easily, by seeing things and assuming that they're part of something that we know and they're not. If you've looked at pictures of something that's, and you say, oh, that's a blah, 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 and then you realize that it's taken from miles away, it doesn't look the same. One of the pictures that I had for you today was taken by Google Earth. The technology behind Google Earth gives us an incredible capacity to see what happens around the world and to get images that we might not otherwise get. I mean, we've been taking pictures from close up since forever, not forever, but the last couple of 100 years. Many of us have cameras, so we take pictures, but not many of us can actually take a picture from above the Earth unless we're in an airplane. And we can't take pictures from way above unless we're perhaps on a satellite or we're a drone, as one of the other pictures I had was a picture of a bald eagle flying, taken from a drone. I swear the thing looked terrified, as most people who see drones flying overhead are as well. But when we get distance, our perspective shifts. And so the pictures, some of the pictures from Google Earth, the one that I had for you was a I think it was camels, pictures of camels, and you saw all these camels, but what you were really seeing was just the shadow of the camels. If you looked really carefully, you could see the backbone, but the image that we see and that our brain registers is, oh, those are camels. It's only when you look at it really carefully that you can see what it is. Your brain is registering something that it knew in the past and transferring that to what you're seeing. And you're sort of seeing camels, but sort of not really. But where I really wanted to go today was not so much about what your eyes do, but about the invitation that they give you. The invitation to learn about the world around you. Not just about things and spatial realities, but about the world around you. Because everything you see can be identified in terms of a fact. That the pew is made out of a certain kind of wood, it's a certain kind of color, it's a certain shape and height, and you could recreate that. We're now at the point where we can translate visual stimuli into sounds so that someone who's completely blindfolded can find something lying on the floor simply by an oral guiding system to it. So you get a beep when you're getting closer, and the beep disappears when you're further away, and beep, 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 and there it is, you pick up the golf ball or whatever it is that's sitting on the ground. Similarly, we're getting to the technology where we'll be able to have implants in our eyes or in our bodies that read stimuli in front of us and project an image that's pretty close to accurate in our brain, so that we'll be able to see things despite the fact that we have no physical visual stimuli. You can assume that that could happen as well with any of the other senses, with smell or with hearing or with touch, that we can snuggle up into a soft blanket which is nowhere near us simply by having that image given to us by some kind of electronic stimuli within us. So think of Star Trek and the holodeck, and that technology may not be as far off as we would like it to be. The questions around the access to that technology are completely different. But all of that information, we can take that information in, we can sort it so that we recognize objects, we see them, we understand what they are. But do we really know them? The book that I just finished reading, a book called The Gods of Gotham by Lindsay Fay, a fabulous fiction, based in New York City in 1845, the year that the police force was brought into being. And one of the people who was sort of made one of those coppers, as they were called, because they had a copper star, to identify them as a police officer. At one place toward the knitting together of all the loose ends at the end of the story, he talks about how we see things, but seeing those things does not tell us the stories of those things. In the book, he's talking about a scrape along the side of a staircase, and then he goes into the story of that scrape, telling a sadness and an anger that brings to him a whole set of understanding, a whole set of memories that otherwise anyone going up the stairs would just see a little scrape. For him, it was an entire story. We have entire stories in our homes when you pick up a piece of cutlery that used to belong to your grandmother, or there's a picture on the wall that was given to you when you were married, or something that you pick up that was one of your children's that long after they've gone home they've left behind. Most of us want to get that stuff out of the house, but there are things like that around that tell us, they've got stories attached to them, and we give them meaning and power and energy. If someone came in and said, I'm going to take that bowl that your baby used to eat out of, and I'm going to give you one exactly the same, it's not a problem, it's exactly the same bowl, right? It's not going to upset you, right? We have an attachment to those things. We don't want to give that up. If that bowl breaks, we don't just go out and buy another one to replace it, because our stories are related to that actual object, not just to what they look like. But one of the things that Lindsay Fay put in the voice of this protagonist, Tim, in the novel, was in the next few moments when he went up the staircase. He talked about there are things that you see that take you into a story. And then there are things that you see that tell you a story you cannot bear. And so you pull back and you only see. You describe what it is you can see. You can describe that to someone in detail. But what it's doing to you inside is so immense that you seek not to go there. You protect yourself from that. You see only the stuff of it, and we inure ourselves to those things that might hurt, that might cost us, that might challenge us, that might move us to see something in a different way. And I felt that that was a profound insight. I watched all these videos and listened to all this stuff by these behavioral and experimental psychologists and scientists and neuroscientists on vision. But this person who wrote this story, this work of fiction, seemed to have the most profound things to say about our vision. What are the stories that we see as we move through our everyday? The stories tied up with memories. The stories tied up with relationships, tied up with people we have loved and people we have lost, tied up with people who have hurt us, and those hurts have yet to be healed, tied up with places that brought us joy or anxiety, that brought us a sense of place in the world or made us feel like outcasts. There are things in our houses and things in our lives, stuff in our workplace, and probably things here that draw us into those stories. So while Bo Lotto was telling us about how we get, or not Bo Lotto, sorry, it was Bruce Hood, is telling us about those things that draw us into our memories and so give us the possibility to see, it's the stories that give us the real ability to see. And the question is, how much courage do we have in the face of those stories? How much courage do we have to stand in front of something that tells us who we really are, that reminds us of something that we did in the past or someone who did something to us in the past? How much courage do we have to stand in front of those and let the whole thing pass us by? Let the whole thing go by our vision so that we see and understand our place in it, understand its effect on us, understand how we can go forward from it healed in a new way, if indeed healing is at all possible. Because if everything we see is tied to something that the brain has known before, for us to unravel some of those stories and come to understand them in a way that will help and heal us is a very important part of our lives. As Tim went up the stairs and saw the situation of catastrophe in front of him, it was awful what was going on. But what he didn't tell us, what was going on, was what was going on in his heart. The reality of the breaking apart of bonds that he thought were strong, that were insoluble. The breaking apart of hopes and dreams that he'd carried with him for years. The recognition that he needed to act in a different way, if not for himself, for the love of another. We do that in our lives, sometimes regularly, but often far too few times when we look at what's happening, see the story behind it, and then act in a way, if not for ourselves, for those whom we love. We are inundated with visual images on a regular basis. I don't have to tell you that. It happens. Our televisions, our computer screens, advertising, moving advertising in our environments are constantly giving us messages. And our brain, whether we like it or not, is tying those messages to memories, tying it to images, tying it to what we consider normal. Red and green for 30 seconds becomes normal. Our brain considers it normal. So when we are inundated with images that tell us what our world, our lives, the stuff we have is supposed to be like, over the course of years, what becomes normal? What becomes normal is what our minds, our brains have been seeing, what's been coming in through our eyes. So we suddenly think that we have to have a house that looks like this, or a car that runs like that, or this number of children, or whatever, because those are the things that become normal through the cues that we're given visually and in so many other ways in our world. And many of the big things that advertising companies are doing now is inserting people and storylines in their advertising that come right up alongside you and sit down beside you on the couch and resonate with you completely. That use of empathy that I've mentioned before in an advertising manner, a marketing manner. It's becoming more and more difficult for us to identify what it is we're really seeing and what it means to us. So I believe it's becoming more and more important that we spend time unraveling the stories of what it is that we see. So when I see an advertisement for Cuba and a great vacation, what is the story behind that? What are the elements at play in that? What are the challenges to me in that? What are the challenges to the people of Cuba in that? Untangling the stories of that will tell us much more fully what it is that is before our eyes. Our brain can only take in little bits of light. It takes all those little bits of light and it interprets the color and the value of it, and then it plants it alongside something that's already in there, and bam, we've got meaning, we've got an idea of something, and we believe more often than not that it's real. When we can untangle the stories, we can find out perhaps what is actually real and train our brains to tell us the truth instead of just giving us a picture that someone else wants us to see. Next week, we're going to come together and talk about touch, only I'm actually not going to be here. I'm going to be brought to you by video from the walk, unless I haven't been able to make it to the second day and I'm actually here, which is very possible. But we'll talk about touch because I chose it as the last one because I figured I was going to be acutely aware of how I was physically feeling next Sunday morning. But I have enjoyed this journey, and I think that we should do this every other year or something, because the rate of understanding and scientific advance in the things that I'm talking about is exponential. So I couldn't have actually said a lot of these things 2 or 3 years ago because they hadn't been explored. So I find it fascinating that our world continues to develop ideas and test them out and find out more and more about ourselves, almost at the same speed with which we twirl around and rotate the sun. So next week, touch, and I'll be with you remotely. And in the meantime, keep your eyes peeled and find the stories behind what it is that you see, so that you can find the meaning and what it should, the place that it should find in your heart. Thank you.